Hey, thank you everybody for coming to the panel, and I'd like to invite the panelists to come on up here and I'll introduce them. And we have a great panel for you. And first of all, did you all enjoy the keynote presentation? Okay. Yeah, our team really put together a great presentation. I really want to thank them for all their hard work. We're really excited. And the conference is really going great. We have so many people. We're sold out just about in every session. This session I put together myself because I believe that this is the seminal issue to really propel cloud computing going forward. And when we look at the old models, of course, the old models were all about you had your data center, you might have a data center in every country you do business in, you know, it's your computers, it's your servers, it's your employees. In the new model, it's a cloud computing model, it's a shared model, and in many cases, you're outsourcing that idea of who's managing my information, who's managing my data to a trusted organization. What policies do they have in place? What procedures do they have in place? Who are their employees? And this seminal point is really critical because when we get to shared systems, today Salesforce.com has 100,000 customers using our services. Of course, we're a shared system. We have data centers today in the US and Asia. We're about to open one in Europe. This has been a transformational point for our customers. That's why I thought this panel is so exciting. And today on this panel, we couldn't have a better panel put together for us. First of all, we have Vivek Kundra with us, which is very exciting. Vivek just stepped down as the US federal government chief information officer, but is tremendously vested in these issues. And in today's New York Times, he published an op-ed based on his philosophy for how governments should transform and change into the cloud based on something he came up with in the US government working for President Obama called Cloud First. And we're going to hear about that today. And we're going to hear about the ideas and the concepts and what Vivek is hearing from not only the governments around the world, but also from its constituents. And then we have, I think, just one of the truly transformational and great executives in the world, and somebody who I got to know at the World Economic Forum, and that's Neelie Kroes. And Neelie Kroes, for many of you who might not be familiar with her here in San Francisco, is the Vice President of the European Commission responsible for the digital agenda. She is one of the most forward thinkers and visionaries, and she has insights into how we should think about key issues like human rights, like about trust and transparency, and about the transportability of data and logic in regards to these systems. And she's inspired me and transformed my own thinking. And before taking on this job, she was also the European Commissioner for Competition and has a very, very deep understanding of business and technology and how they work together. And I'm so, so delighted that she made it here all the way from Brussels. Thank you very, very much for coming such a long way. And I also want to thank her daughter-in-law who lives here because I think that was a key reason that we were able to get her. So thank you also. You know, sometimes things work in mysterious ways. And Haraguchi-san, who is going to join us on the panel, had to stay in Tokyo for the election of the new Prime Minister. And I've asked Angela Ahrendts, the CEO of Burberry, representing a truly global company with business and operations all over the world, to kind of represent the customer perspective in regards to this concept of digital global governance. So let's go ahead and let's start the panel, if that's all right with everybody. And what I would like to do is, I guess, you know, Vivek, I'd like to just, I'd like to start with you. And you know, you did publish this great piece in the New York Times. I read it last night. And, you know, what inspired you to write that? And, you know, what is your vision around the cloud and cloud first, you know, as you call it?
Sure. So, Mark, as I have worked in various roles within the public sector, from Arlington County, Virginia, to the state of Virginia, to a city in Washington, D.C., to the U.S. government, one of the things that I've noticed is the vast inefficiencies in how we spend taxpayer dollars, hard-earned taxpayer dollars. In the federal government alone, we spend $80 billion a year. And one of the most frustrating issues was to actually see project after project fail, because it was based on the old IT model. And what that model was essentially, vendors would bid for government contracts, And their expertise wasn't superior technology or innovation. It was the fact that they had a PhD in understanding how to navigate the complicated procurement process. All of a sudden, the government would award these multi-million, multi-billion-dollar contracts. And you fast forward and you ask, what value did you get 2, 3, 5, 10 years in some cases? And there's negative value. I'll give you a data point. The Department of Defense spent 10 years and $850 million on trying to implement a personnel system, and there was nothing to show for it a decade later. We cannot continue on that path in this tough physical environment that we're in. That is why, as part of the administration, we instituted a cloud-first policy, recognizing that some of the most amazing innovation is happening not within the old model of what I would call the IT cartel, where people continue to win these contracts, and their objective is essentially to put in as many people as possible and bill at exorbitant rates. We cannot continue, and we need to make sure that as governments around the world are facing these tough economic times, that we do find the innovative path in terms of how we serve our citizens more effectively.
Now, as CIO of the federal government, one of the things you were really taking on was how many data centers and kind of islands of information there are in the federal government. Can you give us some insight into that? What does the U.S. federal government's architecture looks like? How many data centers are there, and what do you think this opportunity is for cost reduction?
Well, there are over 2,000 data centers within the United States government. In 1998, there were 432. So we literally went from 432 data centers to 2,094. On top of that, there are over 12,000 applications, major applications, across the federal government. So on infrastructure alone, we spend about $24 billion every year. Now, think about where all that money is going, and think about how we actually serve our constituents. Because all that money is being spent on redundant infrastructure, on redundant applications, that we're not able to optimize the experience that the American people have with their government, because all the money is being spent in the wrong places.
So Vivek, what do you think the government should be doing? What is the care plan here for the U.S. federal government in regards to IT?
Well, we're already seeing it with the cloud-first policy. We've already seen agencies such as GSA, we've seen the Recovery Board, and USDA actually adopt the cloud-first policy. On something as simple as email, we're able to cut the cost down by $42 million by moving to the cloud. Now imagine the opportunity as we look at applications across the board. We've projected that we could move in the next couple of years about $20 billion worth of IT projects to the cloud, saving the federal government $5 billion very, very quickly.
Now you've inspired us, and I was fortunate to chair something which was really this Tech America Commission to look at what are the best practices for governments to move into the cloud, and we published something which is the Cloud Buyers Guide, which I think many people have seen. I think it's at cloudbuyersguide.org, which is how governments can move to the cloud, and it's kind of this independent commission of government and computer scientists and others to make those recommendations. What if you were to do one key thing, what would you do today if you were a government? I mean, obviously governments seem like they're moving more cautiously. How do you think government should move forward in that one key area?
Well, I think part of what's about to happen in the coming months and years is that there's going to be intense downward pressure as a result of budgets that are going to be cut. And what you're seeing across the board, agencies, whether they're at the federal, state, or local level, is that they're having to zero out their capital expenditures. So when you move away and you take away all the CapEx, you're left with OpEx. Now, how do you innovate in that space? So what I would encourage is every government, internationally and domestically, to actually start thinking about how do you not just look at the model where you do more with more or less with less, but how do we do actually much more with less? And that's the environment and the reality we find ourselves in. And I think in the coming years and months ahead, as I've said, you're going to see a major shift to cloud.
Now, obviously, these are very forward-thinking comments and aggressive comments, I think. So when you're delivering those comments inside the U.S. federal government, what is the reaction that you get from lawmakers or from, from administration personnel?
Well, there are different types of CIOs that you meet within government.
I'm familiar with that.
Some of them are very innovative, forward-thinking, and they're the ones who've embraced this agenda and are driving forward very, very aggressively. In other areas, what you get is a false choice, where what people do is erect these barriers around security and privacy, which in some ways are very unfounded. And the reason I think they're unfounded and ridiculous in a lot of ways is because the United States government already has outsourced over 4,700 systems. These systems are already in the hands of Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, you name it. Yet when it comes to cloud, for some reason, these fears are raised. The government engages in contracting language, and these contracts are designed to make sure that those provisions are taken care of. So we've worked very, very hard to move forward in that direction, and we're actually seeing massive adoption of cloud technologies across the board.
Well, that's fascinating, and I want to come back to that, and I want to ask Neelie about data governance. So we've heard about Eurocloud, we've heard about should countries have their own cloud, should vendors have to have data centers in residency, in country. How do you look at that today? You've been studying this cloud computing phenomenon. I think more than any other regulator that I've met anywhere in the world, you've been the most visionary. Can you give us your synthetic thinking? How do you see this coming about?
If you allow me, Mark, just to make a remark up front. Rightly mentioned, I was the Commissioner for Competition Policy, and I'm so grateful with that experience, for I'm a strong believer of competition. It keeps people awake, it keeps states awake. Having said that, at that time, when I finished my first term in office, and there was no opportunity to think of a second one, there was just a miracle, and I was asked to join the second term from the Commission Barroso. People were just addressing me in the streets, wherever I was, and said, Neelie, great for you for your second term, but poor you with this portfolio after competition policy. And I discussed it with my people, and I said, that is just keep quiet and let's first prove that we can implement what we have in mind. For this is the most fascinating digital agenda portfolio you can imagine, time-wise and also content-wise. So we did deliver our digital agenda at that time, and I took a risk, and my people were warning me, and I said, every European digital in 2013, and my people said, are you not interested in continuing your term? For this will be a disaster. People can check. And I said, we have to. The main issue, and I'm coming to the cloud computing, is if you were saying every European digital, that you can't afford to let people out of this whole development. It is a new way of living. Having said that, then of course you need to give trust and security. For people are willing to move, but only when there is trust and security. And that is at stake when we are talking about cloud computing in a very important way, so to say. And I'm completely agreeing with Vivek that it is cost reduction tremendously. So it couldn't be a better moment, for even ministers of finance are now interested in my remarks. Can you imagine? And people are interested in the healthcare, in education, in environment, and name it. But trust and security. And therefore, I just organized a meeting with 60 out of you and other very competent people, and we discussed cloud computing. For there is one issue that I want to give absolutely in clear language. It is not me, Commission, it is not Council of Ministers that is predicting and that is just mentioning this is the regulation, that's it. It is you. It is really the ones who are not only very much available and able to fill in, but it's also you who can give the trust and the security. Having said that, so in the discussion, in the dialogue, And by the way, today is the last day you can react, and we have had hundreds and hundreds of reactions on our first discussion of the cloud computing strategy. We will go on, and we will just hopefully publish our strategy next year. And I'm just a secret for you, but keep it for us. I asked Vivek, be my advisor, and he said yes. So my day is made. And having said that, and that doesn't mean that we will follow all the advices for 100% of Vivek before he is thinking that, but it has to be done. In a democracy, by the way, and now I'm coming to your point, in a democracy, it's taking more time. I think there is not a better system than a democracy involving people, but it takes time, and it also takes hurdles to take. Can you imagine Europe, 27 member states with different cultures, with different backgrounds, very fascinating, but they have joined the family together out of a long history with different systems, communist countries from former days, not that long ago. Very fascinating people, very involved in European thought. We are just taking the line that we should indeed implement what is at stake, and not only cost-wise. It is also a matter of, for small and medium-sized enterprises, it is great to have cloud computing for how can you start, and I'm certain that you all are aware this is the opportunity. So, clear question. Is it a challenge? Yes. Do we need to implement it? Absolutely. Strategy will be there. There will still be not an ideal situation that it is globally clear on the short term, but I'm absolutely certain that we can manage within Europe anyhow, and we shouldn't do it only within Europe. It should combined with as well the US, as well with Asia and others, for this is per definition a global issue. So answer on your question is yes.
And that's why I'm so excited that you're here. And you know, I've got just two quick follow-up questions that have been on my mind since we had our first meeting. You know, I was very touched by your focus on how human rights connects with cloud computing and the importance of privacy and trust and security, that's the connection, I think, that in the United States we don't completely understand the very, very deep respect and very deep focus that you have on human rights, and we've talked about that focus, and that's where the trust aspects come from, that there's nothing more important than that human connection with the network, and what does that mean? Can you help us understand that from an American perspective, or you know, from a perspective of individuals who aren't living directly in Europe today?
For us, human rights and the freedom of taking your own decisions and being certain that as well security, as well trust is guaranteed is main. And even if it's taking more time, very interesting debates in the European Parliament, by the way, and of course, different political parties do have different political points of view also on this issue, but for us, the human rights system is main. That is the base of our democracy, so to say.
Yeah, and I think that's where it seems like so much of your policy comes from, that key point, and that's why I just found that was really, critical to understand. And when we had a very interesting meeting at the World Economic Forum with many vendors and other government officials, and when we were talking about that and how do we build more trust, because I think from our perspective, without trust there is no cloud computing. There's nothing more important in Salesforce than trust, and I think that how that actually gets translated down to the individual, this is very, very important. And then also we talked about the transportability of data and logic, and that data residency itself is not a seminal issue, but the seminal issue is portability and transportability.
And it is also a challenge, and I'm aware that it is a bit risky to touch upon that one. It's not only giving trust that nothing will happen when you put your data, and that could be personal, but it could be business-wise, just in the cloud. But we should be also aware who is delivering the technical instruments, and is that also taken into account to give a part of trust and security? For not everyone who is involved in this game has the same level of, so to say,
yes.
Well, I don't need to explain it more.
Yes.
So we need to be absolutely certain that it is also quite clear, not only talking about the content.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole ballgame. I think that is kind of very much, you know, when we talk about what are the government policies on data residency, on privacy, on trust, on security, on transportability, and how do we fundamentally protect the rights of corporations and companies as we move to cloud computing? Yeah. And I mean, that's where you have kind of, I think, changed the game for the vendors and gotten us to reorient around that key focus on those. When I've come back to my own employees, I say, what are we doing on human rights? What are we doing on trust? What are we doing on transportability of logic and data? Yep. And I think that those three values are going to guide us going forward.
And please add security.
And security. Well, I don't think you can have trust without security.
Okay.
So when I say trust, I mean security, I mean privacy. Yeah. I think that's a good, actually, example of kind of the translation between a vendor and that. When I think trust, it's a synthetic word to me, because you can't have trust without the best security in the world, the best privacy in the world, and you can't have trust without transparency. Yeah. And I think that's also a huge shift from the previous paradigm. And that, you know, I think that for our customers, we have to have as much transparency as possible. Yeah. That's how we build trust with our systems. And I mean, I think that before I go to Angela, I'll just say Neelie and I were sitting together, and the Egyptian government made a decision to turn off the internet in Egypt, and we were just sitting in a room with every telecommunications leader possible in this hotel in Davos. And she turned to me and said, is that trust? Is that transparency? And I think that, you know, it was incredible, actually. It was this kind of very seminal moment for me, and you could tell that something amazing was happening.
Can you imagine when, not that long ago, we were faced with situations in the UK, and that some were mentioning a line, could you just cut off? And I was discussing it with my people, and I said, we need to be consistent and consequent. So you can't, even if you get a little bit of feeling that this is awful and so on, you should be consistent, for trust is based on consistency. And, well,
And by the way, this is not just a Middle East issue or a European issue, it's an American issue. Just last week here in San Francisco, we have something called the Bay Area Rapid Transit, which is our BART trains, and I know a lot about it because my grandfather started it in the 1950s and created the architecture for transit. And so I follow everything that happens with it, and then all of a sudden I found out that, you know, basically our government, even though it's kind of a microcosm in that it's, you know, the transit authority, turned off communications in the BART stations because they didn't want protesters to be able to communicate with each other in the stations just last week. So that's kind of a, you know, our BART spring, you know, if you will. It's our own little version of our San Francisco problem. And so I think that it's a common thing that leaders default to control. You know, oh, well, I don't know what to do. Turn off the network. Oh, the protesters are at the BART station. Shut it all down. And that just, I think we saw what just happened with Mubarak, with Gaddafi, with, you know, even in Tel Aviv, you know, the cottage cheese prices are too high. You got 300,000 people in the streets. That's an exciting part of transparency. That's an exciting part of trust, because those users are building the trust and transparency on their own. But I think we have to co-opt it in together. How do you think about that as a global brand? Angela, you're one of the most dynamic CEOs in the world. You run a huge global company. You know, Burberry has to think about these issues, you know, the rights of your own customers, of your employees, the transparency and the trust that you provide. How do you think about the global enterprise and the move to the social enterprise in regards to this governance today.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pull a quote also, Mark, out of your brilliant book that I read over the holidays. And for those of you who haven't, I would buy it at the bookstore and I would read it, and I would buy a couple hundred and send to all your employees, which is what we did. Probably my favorite quote in the book, at the very end, you said that most successful CEOs today are not driven by profit, but also by purpose. And it's one of the core values of our company. And it's funny, just listening to the conversation so far, I think what the cloud, I think what the social revolution, let's call it, is going to cause, and I think it puts the onus back on every one of us that are here at Dreamforce, on every business in the world today. I think you're going to see a massive shift. That I don't think that governments will have the resources. I don't think that I think the onus will be on businesses. And if businesses are creating a social enterprise, you're not a business in a community anymore, you are the community. So therefore, what is your purpose? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to educate? How are you supposed to create jobs? You know, I feel that is what cloud and that is what social media is going to do. And if, you know, if social media can put politicians in office, and if social media can overturn countries, then why can't social enterprises, why can't they make great communities, turn around great cities, turn around great countries? And I think that's a bigger calling for all of us, and that's how I think about it.
You know, you're based in the UK, your office is in London, but you're everywhere in the world. Everywhere I go, Burberry is there. Incredible. And you know, what relationships do you want with all those local governments? Do you want them just to leave you alone? Do you want to be regulated, you know, the way like so many other industries are? How do you want them to affect us as vendors? Do you want them to put together guidelines that we should follow to ensure trust and security and transparency? Do you want the ability for data to easily flow between borders so that your stores in Hong Kong can easily use the same application as your stores in New York or in Munich?
Yeah, Mark, it's a great question. And I think also that you have to build trust. So even as small, you know, Burberry is not a huge company. Burberry's about $2.5 billion, market cap about 10 billion. But whenever I go into a country, I was just in China last month, and I met with the mayor of Beijing, and I met with the mayor of Shanghai, and we are relatively small in relationship to, I'm sure, a lot of organizations that they're doing business with. But I want to look them in the eyes. I want them to trust Burberry. I want them to trust the company. We need them, and I need to understand how they feel about these things. So only then can we stay ahead of the curve and craft our vision around it. And then you can also talk openly, and you can help influence if they trust you and they believe in you and they see your success rate, you can influence the policies that maybe they'll put in place. And I think that's what we're trying to do around the world, maybe on a different level, but you know, in terms of communicating. And we do have a very wonderful added benefit that our chairman also happens to be the chairman of Standard Chartered Bank, which is one of the, I think one of the world's greatest banks today. So we get tremendous counsel from him, and that I think only guides us further. But I think the onus is on business. The onus is on CEOs to set the policy, not just to allow it to be done to us. Yeah,
so it's a tone from the top. And that is the beginning of where the trust starts, right? Because if that is very much what the issues were in Arab Spring, right? It was a tone from the top issue. And the way that those leaders handled those protests were, you know, incongruent. Their values were incongruent with their constituents. And that is what created that problem, the inability to shift and change in that. And you know, like I said in my keynote, you know, I think we're going to see a corporate spring. You know, we will have the same issues for companies, where it will either be their customers or it will be their employees and CEOs, you know, who love to have a command and control position as much as, you know, a third world dictator does. I think in many cases, it just doesn't fly. You know, you have it is much more of a society and a community, and exactly like you said, much more of a country than ever before. And I think that we're seeing the beginning of that, and that this kind of the merging and of the culture and the technology is really key. Well, Vivek, can you put that into place for us? You know, how you're a huge thinker in that area. You're going to become a huge thinker at Harvard around this issue. How should we think about that global change and the global shift in regards to how it's being motivated by this movement to cloud computing?
Well, so beyond cloud, right, in terms of cloud will provide you that underlying infrastructure. It's actually what happens on top of that cloud that really, really matters. So let's look at social, for example. Human beings inherently are hardwired to be social creatures. Yet, if you look at most of the institutions that have been created, and you could actually see it through the 3 successive revolutions, right? So in the agrarian revolution, you could literally live an entire lifetime within a 25-mile radius because all the means of production of food and commerce were basically conducted in that era. Then came the Industrial Revolution with trains and the steam engine that would move you across, and global commerce that interconnected shipping. That created a whole other mechanism that allowed people to find each other and connect at a global scale. And now with the information revolution, what we're seeing is that in the same click of a button where you can move billions of dollars across countries and move markets and trade in currencies, in the same way what's beginning to happen is that these very large monolithic institutions are beginning to recognize that power is shifting away from that old model where the view was you had subjects that needed to be governed and governments that would govern those subjects, away to the point where you've got people that are self-organizing, they're self-regulating, they're recognizing that they can demand much more of the people that they've elected to office. They can demand much more of their institutions, and they don't have to stand for subpar services. So we're seeing that in every government, whether you look at what happened in terms of the Arab Spring and the use of social media and the ability to use these underlying technologies. You know, whether you look at what happened with broadband deployment globally, you look at cheap computing, both storage and CPU, that now allows people to go back to their original roots, which is people are generally social creatures. And how do we make sure that these technologies unleash that potential, rather than the old model where all these institutions that are monolithic and archaic were designed to be much more command and control.
Where's the rub? Where do you think leaders need to change? When you've been talking to the leaders of our country and of other countries, where do you think leaders and their consciousness need to change?
Well, I think these are the questions of our time, right? And what I mean by that is you had a great example in terms of KLM, and actually having people coming up to their customers and saying, hey, you're traveling here, you're interested in certain things. Now, the question is going to be, there needs to be a cultural shift, right? Because I'm not sure most people would want to hear from the IRS in a very social way, or other institutions. But I think you're beginning to see some of that shift where TSA, for example, with wait times at airports, is using Twitter and social media and Facebook, and is letting people know, for example, what the average wait time is in certain lines before they leave. For leaders, I think they need to understand that, especially in democracies where they're elected, that the word public servant means that you're serving the people, and that there's a huge shift in power that's happening that I don't think a lot of people recognize. And I think you're beginning to see a lot of adoption when it comes to social media, but I think a lot of leaders are just adopting it at face value, which is elections and so forth. But when you translate that into governance, that hasn't really happened in a huge way. It still hasn't happened in the private sector in a huge way. I think you're going to see a fundamentally different government and set of economy where we're going to create value in areas that we haven't seen.
Neelie, how do you see these leaders needing to change? You have that same issue. You have interaction with so many leaders around the world, business leaders and government leaders. Where do they get it, and where do they not get it? Where are they struggling, and what advice would you have for them to kind of get them to that next level of growth for themselves?
Two remarks. There is hope, so and that makes a lot of sense. The younger generation is born with that type of attitude, and it's remarkable what that makes for an effort and for an influence. The cultural shift will be absolutely in their hands to force and to push the older generation. Just to mention one example, normally spoken in my former position, I had advisors of an older age, professors and whatever. And now I'm focused on really the youngsters. So I do have a team of very young people, and I think the youngest is 16 and the oldest is in the 20s. So it is great to have Vivek. He is a bit older, but those are the ones who really can make the difference in the culture, and that we need. There is one other issue, and I would love to add it to our discussion. This culture shift and this possibility also is of immense importance for the role of females. And I'm not talking about the females here, for we found our way and no problem at all. But those females in underdeveloped countries, those females in no democracies and so on, they are absolutely facing a challenge in putting that as a difference in their way of living. And leaders, and talking about all I'm meeting and all my colleagues, we should be more listening, in a listening mood, and not saying, this is it, this is the regulation, and then wash our hands and say, we did our job. That's not the way you should tackle it, but you know me in the meantime, Mark.
Mm-hmm. The power of women, the power of youth, the power of leadership. Angela, can you help us with that? What do you see as that, you know, you're meeting with so many CEOs. I know that you're also on your way to India for a major conference and event on some of these critical issues. Mm-hmm. Where do you see leaders, you know, struggling in terms of this next generation of leadership? You know, how do they become more social, more open, more collaborative, right? More of a focus on the individual contributors. How do they get more alignment in their organizations? What do you see as the key thing?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is to put in the Salesforce platforms, right? But which I think you have to have the platforms to enable the open communication, and I think that's all we're saying. It is being transparent. It is being. We talked about building trust, and in order to build trust, you have to be authentic, you have to be clear, you have to communicate, and I do think it's what that next generation wants. But let's not totally write off the older generation either. You have a guy speaking tomorrow, Clayton Christensen, who wrote a brilliant article in this month's HBR called "The Higher Ambition Leader," and he talks about how it's business's responsibility going forward to not only add economic value, but to also find a way to add greater social value. And I think that's what this next generation, and I think that's, and what if we put the social value ahead of the economic value? And because I do think that's what the next generation wants. And so, you know, if we put that lens, if we put our business through that lens, if everywhere we went we said, how could we add greater social value? And I do believe that will lead to economic value. But I think that's the kind of merger that you'll see between the digital generation, between governments, between business. I think that's another huge convergence that just is inevitable.
Yeah, very exciting. Yeah, actually, you mentioned the book, and Carly, who's here, we're writing a new book. And it's a complicated book because we're writing about the social revolution and about leadership and how is it transforming. And what we see is it's a doubling down on the success of that individual, on the customer. It's a new culture that's more open, built on trust and transparency. It's a more collaborative business process, and I think that that's true in the government too. It has to be more collaborative and less top-down, and more of a focus on individual contributors. And I think that's also what you get from the focus on the youth as well, you know, that the individuals start to show up as the, you know, key people. We all saw how, you know, a single individual in Tunisia, you know, was the beginning of the process. He had no power, he had no official position, but he was able to topple the government through some very strategic decisions that he made. And then as a leader, how do you get this alignment in your organization with these technologies? How can you get a vision and a set of values to make it happen? And then the doubling down of leadership itself, listening, you know, and hearing what's going on, because that's one of the great things these tools offer us, is the ability to truly listen in our decision making. Well, anyway, I want to thank all three of you for being here today. It's so great to have this perspective at Dreamforce. We've never done this before, and we're just really delighted. So Neelie and Vivek and Angela, thank you so much. And please thank them, everybody. Thank you.